Have you ever tried to make a sweet wine and you thought you did everything right only to come home to exploded bottles everywhere, corks blown out, wine sprayed all over the walls? Well, today we're going to tell you how to properly sweeten a wine at home without having these catastrophic results. The wine I'm going to use to demonstrate is Cabernet Sauvignon Rosé. So this is made in the Saignée method, where you pull some juice off of the skins. So you can kind of make a bigger red wine, and you can also make a nice light rosé for easy drinking. And I'm going to make this kind of a crowd pleaser for the people that aren't really your dry wine drinkers. We're going to make this one about 5% sugar. That should be great for the people that want to have a nice dessert wine or a wine at a picnic. Let's first solve a couple misconceptions. A lot of people seem to think that potassium metabisulfite will kill the yeast and stop fermentation and also stop it from re-fermenting. Well, this just isn't true. Wine yeast has a massive sulfite tolerance. Some yeasts, actually many wine yeast strains, will actually produce a little bit of sulfur dioxide, the key component in potassium metabisulfite. It just takes an insane amount to actually kill the yeast, so you might as well just rule that out from the start. The second misconception is that potassium sorbate will kill the yeast. That also isn't true. If you have a big enough colony of yeast in your wine to sustain fermentation, you can add all the potassium sorbate you want and it'll still sluggishly ferment along, and that's the last thing you want happening in your bottle. Leads to that CO2 production, pressure buildup, and boom, messes. So what do these two things do? Potassium metabisulfite is a great antioxidant. It scavenges oxygen, and a lot of these bad microbes that can spoil a wine, whether they turn it into vinegar or turn it into kind of a sherry type smelling wine, they really need oxygen to do their thing. It also inhibits microbial growth to some extent. So most of these bacteria really don't have a very high sulfite tolerance. So they're going to be rendered useless or dormant as long as you have an appropriate level of sulfite in the wine. Potassium sorbate is really just going to coat the yeast cells. It's really the sorbic acid that's doing the job here. The potassium sorbate is just a carrier for sorbic acid. It's about 74% sorbic acid. And by coating those cells, you prevent them from budding and multiplying. So the key is that if you're going to sweeten a wine, before you add sugar or before you get it in a situation where it's in a bottle, you want that wine to be crystal clear. You want essentially such a low yeast count that it's insignificant and it really just can't ferment. You need to be able to see right through that wine. If there's even the slightest haze, forget about it. It'll probably try to ferment on you and it'll probably blow up your bottles no matter what you do, unless you were to pasteurize it or something. Now, we normally don't pasteurize a wine though, because we don't want to cook the wine. If you looked at one of my recent videos, I believe it was called How to Tell Your Wine Has Gone Bad, we did some tests where we heated a wine and we didn't heat a wine, and it was pretty dramatic how much aroma loss occurred just from heating it to about 140 degrees F for a short period of time.
In a world where good wine can be difficult to make, these three friends subscribed to the Home Winemaking channel and went to patreon.com/makewine to learn more. And they were happy.
So now that you've decided you want to sweeten your wine and you are not scared anymore, there's kind of two ways to go about it. One, you can stall the fermentation. This is more of an advanced technique that I wouldn't recommend for beginners, but if you want to check that out, I've got a video, what's the best way to stop a fermentation. Go take a look at that. Today though, we're going to talk about back sweetening. This is going to be the most common way to sweeten a wine at home. It's pretty reliable, it's pretty easy. Once your wine's crystal clear, rack it into a fresh container, because you're going to need to be mixing things up and you don't want to stir up anything that has settled out. This could include yeast particles that have settled out, but it also could include tartrate crystals if you've cold stabilized it to drop out any crystals in bulk storage versus having those crystals form in bottle. Now we're going to want to sulfite it. If you can test your SO2 levels, that's going to be ideal here. So you can use something like a Vinmetrica SC200 or SC300 to see how much baseline sulfite is in the wine. If you don't have that, you can probably assume there's probably not much unless you have been adding it kind of aggressively along the way. The other thing you're going to want, this is basic winemaker stuff, you're going to want a pH meter. If you're going to stick with winemaking at all, get a pH meter. I'll put a link to a good one in the video description. Without one, you're pretty much gambling every time with these wines. With your pH meter, take a look at what the pH of your wine is though. In this particular case, we were sitting at about 3.27. That gives us an idea of how much free sulfur dioxide or free SO2 it's going to take to basically smash down those bacteria that are going to try to do bad things to the wine, and also keep malolactic bacteria dormant. This isn't particularly a bad bacteria. We use it often in winemaking, but the next step is going to be to add potassium sorbate, aka sorbic acid, and you really need to make sure that that malolactic bacteria stays dormant, because if it doesn't, it'll consume the sorbic acid and it'll create a geranium smell. And obviously, you don't want that in your wine. So based on our pH, we need about 25 parts per million free SO2. I've got a little chart here. It's on smartwinemaking.com. Take a look at that. For the most part, if you take your pH minus 3.0 and multiply it by 100, that's going to give you a pretty ballpark estimate of how much free SO2 that you need. So to figure out how to kind of convert that, I like to work in milligrams per liter. So 1 milligram per liter equals 1 part per million. This is a 4-liter bottle. I've pulled some wine out of it to make some space for our sugar. I'm going to end up making basically 4 liters here. So I need 25 milligrams per liter times 4 liters. That's 100 milligrams. And potassium metabisulfite is only about 57% free SO2. So we'll divide our 100 by 0.57. That's going to give us about 175 milligrams of potassium metabisulfite to reach that free SO2 level. And that's assuming we have nothing. I'm assuming I actually probably have about 10 parts per million, but this is a relatively oxidative thing we're doing here. So I'm assuming I'm going to lose that in this process of sweetening. Whatever you do, don't mix up milligrams with grams. Also, don't shift a decimal place somewhere. Just be careful because you don't want to accidentally add like 1,000 times of what you need to be adding, or even 10 times if you shifted a decimal place. Now that we're keeping our malolactic bacteria that might be harboring in here kind of dormant, now it's time to add this sorbic acid in the form of our potassium sorbate. One thing to keep in mind with both potassium sorbate but also potassium metabisulfite is they have a pretty short shelf life. So if it's over 5 or 6 months old, buy new stuff. Also store it in the fridge. Try to keep it out of the presence of oxygen as much as possible, because this stuff will go bad and you'll think you're doing the right thing, and then boom, 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 blown up bottles everywhere. In most cases, if your wine is in the 11 or 12 or 13% alcohol range and it's a normal pH for a wine that would be sweetened, so that's going to be like 3.2, 3.3, 3.4, you're going to want about 100 parts per million sorbic acid. Sometimes you might want more, is if your pH is a little bit higher, so say it's above 3.5, maybe add 1.5 times that, so 150 parts per million. If your alcohol content is really low, say it's 10, maybe even lower, same thing, add about 1.5 times. Any of these things that kind of make a more favorable condition for second fermentation to occur, that's when you're going to want to kind of up the sorbate a little bit. But for us, we're going to stick with that 100 parts per million, or 100 milligrams per liter. So again, I have a 4-liter bottle here, so I'll multiply my 100 milligrams by 4 liters, and then we'll divide by 0.74 because potassium sorbate is about 74% sorbic acid. One thing that's important with potassium sorbate, but also to some extent with potassium metabisulfite, is you don't want to add it, like just dump it in willy-nilly. You want to dissolve it in a little bit of water and add it really, really slowly, because you don't want to basically overdose this wine with potassium at, a local level, because it'll start to drop out potassium bitartrate crystals. The potassium sorbate can also crystallize if it's kind of too concentrated in this presence of wine. So we'll add it slow, add a little bit, mix it up a little bit, add a little bit more, mix it up a little bit, until you've got it pretty much mixed up. Now that you've got it all mixed up, we'll go ahead and we'll invert our sugar. We're going to use table sugar to do our sweetening. This isn't unusual because the sugars in a grape are glucose and fructose, and table sugar is sucrose, which is just glucose and fructose bonded together. What we're going to do by inverting it is split that bond, and now you have the natural sugars that would be in a grape. To invert it, we're just going to add a little bit of water to the sugar. I basically add just enough water to make it so that I can simmer it. I don't want to add a lot of water because I don't want to water back my wine. And then I'll add about 1/4 gram of tartaric acid per 100 grams of sugar. And what that'll do is increase the acid while I simmer this on the stove. And we're going to simmer this for about 30 minutes. At 30 minutes, with that increased acid or lower pH, you can start to split that molecule and invert the sugar. The reason we do this is because it's going to taste a little bit sweeter when it's inverted. And when you're doing your bench trials, where you're kind of testing how much sugar you think you want to put in the wine, if you do it with just sucrose, you're going to think you need more sugar and you're going to end up over sweetening the wine. So if you invert it, the wine's going to pretty much stay like it was when you bottled it. You're not going to have any surprises where it's too sweet later. Another thing that's somewhat important is when you're tasting this and you're doing your little bench trials, taste it at the temperature you plan to serve it. So most of the time we're going to serve sweet wines chilled. And if you're tasting it warm, you're probably going to want less sugar, versus if you're tasting it chilled, where it becomes a little bit more crisp, it might need a little bit more sugar. Our 5% sugar figure, that's just it talking in grams per liter, that's 50 grams per liter times 4 liters, that's 200 grams of sugar. So nice and basic conversion here. So my sugar's chilling. I'm going to go grab it and we'll go ahead and we'll slowly add it into this wine. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. With winemaking, and this is assuming you're working with fresh fruit, it's not as important that you're, washing your hands like crazy, not touching anything, like might be the case with something like brewing beer. What's actually more important is creating an environment where only the things you want to live can live. Because in reality, this has never been sterilized. It's not like you bring this in off the vineyard and you run it through a pasteurization system. Nope, it comes in and it comes in with spiders and whatever else is on these vines, dirt, and you ferment it. So you kind of have to work under the assumption that if there's something bad that can do bad things to your wine, it's already in here, and it's up to you to make sure that it cannot do its bad thing. So we'll add this nice and slow here. I like to always add anything nice and slow. I have degassed this a little bit, but anytime you add to a wine, it's always nice to add slow, just in case there's a little more CO2 than you think there is in there. Now I'm going to top up a little bit with one of the wines that I kind of stole off here. And then I'll just shake this up. If I was using a larger batch, like a 6-gallon batch, I'd use my mixer degasser, basically some sort of wine whip to mix this up, but this is just a little baby batch, so we'll just kind of stir it up. Once you get it kind of stirred up, it's going to take a little while to really integrate. You could bottle it, but there's some risk that you do get a little bit of that crystallization of the potassium sorbate, which could leave some little bit of sediment in your bottles. So if you want a nice presenting wine, what I like to do is put this back in the fridge for about 2 weeks, and then I'll bottle it. If it's too big of a batch to put in the fridge, I'll put it in the coolest place of the basement and leave it for maybe a month before I bottle it, and just make sure that anything that's going to settle out, say a few yeast kind of go dormant and fall out, or things crystallize and fall out, we'll let that happen in here so it's not in the bottle. The second benefit of kind of doing this wait before bottling is a lot of these potassium sorbates unfortunately don't have a expiration date. So I don't really know how long it's been on the shelf before I got it. So in the off chance you got a bad batch, or essentially an old batch of potassium sorbate, and it's gonna start trying to re-ferment again, you kind of want to know about that before you put it in the bottle. It makes for a much less messy situation. I know this video is a little bit more technical than maybe some of you guys are ready for in your winemaking journey, but if you are ready for that and you want to know more technical stuff, make sure to swing by my Patreon page, patreon.com/makewine, where I'll often talk about stuff that just isn't as broad, can't really reach as broad of an audience as what I would need to put it on YouTube. In there, you can ask me questions personally, and that's also going to hopefully help you out, especially when you're working on these unique wines. Hope this was all helpful for you, and thanks for watching.